all fun games.
Yeah, that's a typo. I noticed it once I put it up.
But it's cute.
It's not all fun and games, is what it should say. So tonight is going to be Purim. Rather than waiting till next week, which is the week before Purim, I wanted to give it a little bit earlier so that people have time to prepare. Although Purim is sometimes described as a minor holiday, it does take some preparation, and it does mean that we have to start thinking about the story in advance. So this is going to be a basic summary of both why we celebrate Purim, that's the story of Purim, as well as how we celebrate Purim, the mitzvot involved in it, and then also some of the customs of Purim, because like every holiday, there are also customs that go along with it. All right, so I'm trying to use my phone to connect and see if that works smoother than the laptop, which has had trouble. So we'll see how this works. All right, so the story. So Purim, you have to understand before Purim that Jerusalem fell to Babylon in 586 BCE. And when Jerusalem fell, many of the Jews were taken to the east, to Babylon itself, right? What is now modern day Iraq. Think Baghdad, Babylon. That's the general geography that we're dealing with here. Now, after Babylon fell, when Persia destroyed Babylon, when the new empire destroyed the older empire, many Jews continued further east into the heart of the Persian Empire. And nowadays, of course, we would call that country Iran, which is why to this day there are still many Persian Jews, a few who still live in Iran, but many more who have left Iran. I know in Los Angeles, where I studied for many years, there is a very large Persian Jewish community. And that is very important. It's important to know in modern history, Persia is not an Arab country. Iran is not an Arab country, but it is a Muslim country. All right, so many Jews went into the Persian Empire because this was nice. Now, this is different, right? Because a lot of other people went back to the land of Israel. That is what we see continuing in the rest of the story of the Bible, in Ketuvim, in the books of writings, like the prophet Nehemiah, like the sage, the scribe Ezra, and the others. And there are others, however, who went into Persia, the opposite direction from the land of Israel. Now, Persia, the empire, was generally okay with people being different. Persia was what we would call a multi-ethnic empire. It wasn't made up of just one ethnicity in one border. It was made up of lots of ethnicities ruled under one emperor who controlled everything, kind of. There was local autonomy. There was local independence-ish, but they still had to pay certain taxes. They still had to follow certain rules. They still had to support the Persian military. So it was semi-independent. And in fact, that was the state of Judea all the way up until Alexander the Great came along and beat the Persians. So even though we came back to Jerusalem 70 years after the destruction, we were not 100% independent at that point. Everyone following this so far? Because you need to have this backdrop to understand it. So these minorities, they were accepted within the Persian Empire, which stretched all the way from the border of India down to Ethiopia, which is just an enormous range of territory and an enormous range of communities. And they just wanted us to be loyal to Persia. Now, the bulk of the story of Purim takes place in Shushan, which is known as Susa in Persia. And we know where that is. That is a real historical city. You can go visit the ruins of Susa and know that you're walking the same hallways that Mordechai and Esther and Achashverosh walked. Okay, so what are the main events of the story of Purim? Well, the story begins with Achashverosh, that's the emperor of Persia, getting rid of his previous wife, now called Vashti. Now, he didn't have only one wife, but there was kind of a chief wife. There was sort of a head wife, if you will, that was the most prestigious among all the women that he had. And it was a very possessive thing in his community, so we'll use the term they would have used. So he had lots of wives, but Vashti was number one, and she got into trouble, right? She refused to obey his command as he asked. There's lots of different interpretations of what he was exactly asking when he said, "Come and show your beauty for the men." Some say that it was just inappropriate by itself. Others say he asked her to show up and show her beauty, meaning with nothing else, naked, and that was a bit of a problem. So Vashti says no, and she is out or out. There's some debate of whether she was merely exiled or whether she was actually executed, but there was definite concern that if she wasn't punished, that all the women in the kingdom would start disobeying their husbands too. Because if you can disobey the emperor, then you can certainly disobey your husband. And that was something that the Persians wanted to stamp out. So Ahasuerus eventually gets lonely and decides that he needs a new wife because the other 100 that he already has, I guess, aren't enough. He's not exactly the greatest character. And so he has the pretty girls of the empire brought to him. Esther, who is our heroine, right? Her Hebrew name is Hadassah, and this is the first time that we have somebody with both a Hebrew name and a name they use in another culture. Esther is probably a derivative of Ishtar, which was one of the gods of that area. So it would be the equivalent, you might say, of somebody being named Christian or Muhammad in the modern world, but they're actually Jewish. Right? They've taken a name that was common in their world, probably didn't even have a religious connotation necessarily. It was just a popular name, much like maybe Jesus is in many Latin American communities. And her actual Hebrew name is Hadassah. And that's one reason why the Jewish Women's Organization is known as Hadassah to this day. She was brought to him, and she finds the most favorite. Now, this is the PG version. Because the emperor sampled each woman after she had been prepared for a year, after the non-royalty had been scrubbed off of her and she was now fit to be with the emperor. And he likes her. In fact, everybody seems to like Esther. The phrase that is used over and over, finds favor in their eyes. She was attractive. She seemed to be very cooperative. She was just a nice girl in the classic sense of that generation. We're going to find out at the end, however, she's not just such a pushover. But at this point, that seems to be what Ahasuerus is looking for, and that's what he gets in Esther. Mordecai is Esther's uncle cousin. It's a little complicated in the text, and he seems to already be involved in the government. He sits at the king's gate. That's a term that nowadays would be said like somebody who attends Congress. Right, so not necessarily an actual representative, but definitely someone who is probably part of how government works. And so Mordecai, again, probably as well a derivative of the word Marduk, which was a perfectly fine Persian name at that time. He is already involved in the government. She is now in the palace. He tells her, keep your identity hidden, meaning don't tell people you're related to me, and don't tell people you're Jewish. Inter-ethnic rivalry was very, very common in the Persian Empire. It was the way that people tried to jockey for position. And if she's known as being Jewish, that will earn her enemies simply because she's not supporting their ethnicity, or people will try to use her for their own purposes. And Mordecai says, just keep it under wraps. Just don't tell anybody where you're from, and don't tell them that you're connected to me. Mordecai, while he's doing the government work, overhears a plot to kill the king. He hears two of the guards sort of saying, we should really get rid of this guy, which was a real big common problem during the Persian Empire. Persian emperors were often assassinated, but he rats them out, and it is recorded that he helped save the king's life. That becomes very important later in the story. How are we doing so far? All right, this is the short version. You should read the whole version at some point. So, at the same time, Ahasuerus appoints a guy known as Haman as number 2. Now, we don't know exactly where Haman is from. We hear that he is an Agagite, which is just so much fun to say, which sounds like he is descended from Agag, and Agag was known as being the last named king of the Amalekites. And the Amalekites were the most ancient enemies of the Jewish people. They were the ones who came out to slaughter the stragglers when we were leaving Egypt, not for loot or plunder, but just for the fun of murder. And we had lots of problems with them for a few hundred years. So if Haman does really come from that family, that culture, then what he does is not surprising. Haman is now number 2 of the Persian Empire, and he decides that everybody should bow down to him, and Mordecai refuses to do so. His motivation is a little unclear, because according to Jewish law, at least, we do bow to official people. If you are a citizen of England and you are given a knighthood and you go to Queen Elizabeth II, you would bow, even though you're Jewish. There's nothing wrong with bowing to a king or queen, as long as they don't claim they're God. And if they claim they're God, that's a problem, right? And if they say you have to bow and swear allegiance to a god, that's a problem. But bowing as a sign of respect to someone who's a king or queen is perfectly fine under Jewish law. So why Mordecai refuses to bow may be political. It may be that he knows that he is the new head queen's guy, and he's testing the limits of that power that he might be able to get. He may be trying to entrap Haman in something. Or it could very well be that, as the Midrash says, that Haman would often have idols and other symbols on his clothing in order to make him look like he was worshiping those as well, and therefore Mordecai refused. In any case, Haman has one of the biggest overreactions in all of history. He decides not only to kill Mordecai, but to do it by killing all the Jews across the entire empire. Right? Again, we're stretching all the way from the border of India down to Ethiopia. And that's a problem. And he does that by buying the king's favor. He basically says, I'll give you a ton of money, and then I'll kill them and I'll keep the loot. That was a common thing in the ancient world, where you would buy the right to administer the king's law, and then you would keep any surplus that came as you administered the law. This is a bit of a problem. Now, historically, this may be perfectly natural for the empire, however, because if he only kills Mordecai, then he could anger all of the other Jews, the other members of his ethnicity. And as I said, the Persian Empire was a delicate balance of all these different ethnicities. But if you kill all of them at once, then there's no payback. There's no worry about vengeance. It's kind of like doing the ultimate mob hit, where you wipe out the entire other family, so there's no chance for revenge. So Haman may not have been overreacting. It may have just been very cold, calculating, and he was perfectly fine with mass murder. It allowed him to achieve his ends. Oops, and someone's trying to call me. No, you're not. The Jews got worried about this. In fact, the entire nation of Persia was worried about this, because it sets a really dangerous precedent if you start wiping out entire minorities within the Persian Empire, because who's next? And that doesn't create stability in a multi-ethnic empire. And Esther is convinced by Mordecai to help. Now, he says quite pointedly to her, you may think because your identity is hidden and you're sitting there in the palace that you're safe, but trust me, you're not. I believe that we will be saved from all of this, and I think you're supposed to do it. But if you don't, we'll be saved some other how, and you're going to go down in flames. So she gets the courage to go and talk to the king, and she has a little plan. She invites Haman and the king to come to a party. It's one reason why we have parties in celebration of Purim. And Haman is still unhappy, and he goes to the king to try to ask for permission to kill Mordecai himself early. He's already got permission to kill all the Jews if he just waits until the day of Purim, but he decides he wants to kill him early, and he goes to the king. However, remember how Mordecai saved the king's life? It just so happens, coincidence, that the king is rereading that story and is thinking of how he should honor Mordecai when Haman comes and is waiting for an audience with the king. The king asks Haman then, hey, what do you think I should do to honor somebody that did something nice for me? And Haman thinks to himself, well, who would the king want to honor more than me? It's like ultimate sitcom ridiculousness. It's what happens when you have that big of an ego. Yeah. And Haman gives him all sorts of wonderful advice, and the king says, great, go do that for Mordecai. And that is where Haman begins to realize that his story arc is heading the wrong direction. Mordecai is celebrated. Esther then reveals her Jewish identity to the king, and the king lets the Jews defend themselves. And then we take on this new holiday and celebrate. It is a very dramatic story, one that I highly recommend reading. If you have read it when you were in Hebrew school and little, you may be surprised at how adult the story is. It is a very sophisticated political, emotional drama, and it has some humor as well. And it is a fascinating story and insight into how politics worked in the ancient world and what it was like to live as a Jew in the diaspora, a Jew among other powers, and not to be fully independent. And that's one reason why Purim has become such an interesting holiday, is because it is this reflection of the new status of Jews, where we are not fully independent in our own country, but that we are in these other countries, and we have to roll with the punches that come from whatever the local country's politics and life is throwing at us. Okay, like I said, briefest of summaries of the story. Any questions on it? Okay. What is the story actually trying to tell us? Well, one of the main issues the story is trying to tell us is faith. Famously, the story of Purim, all 10 chapters, does not include the name of God at all. It is the only book of the Bible which misses the name of God in any shape, in any version of God's name at all. There is no mention of God or divinity anywhere in the 10 chapters explicitly. However, Mordecai had this message delivered to Esther, as it quotes, "Do not imagine that you, of all the Jews, will escape with your life by being in the king's palace. On the contrary, if you keep silent in this crisis, relief and deliverance will come to the Jews from another quarter, while you and your father's house will perish. And who knows, perhaps you have attained to the royal position for just such a crisis." This is the feeling of faith that Mordecai exhibits that is at the root of why we celebrate Purim in such special ways, because he is basically saying, I think that somehow we will be spared, meaning there's an implied divine help that's coming, but I and you, we will be the vehicles for this happening. Purim is the last holiday of the Jewish calendar. Remember, the very first holiday of the Jewish calendar is Passover, Pesach. Purim is therefore all the way a full year round. Coming a month before Pesach is the last holiday of the Jewish calendar. If you look at the story of Pesach, we are carried along the story of Pesach. God and Moses does everything for the nation. Right? We literally say that God took us with an outstretched hand, that God carried us on wings, that we were carried and brought out. We're not even barely walking when we leave the land of Egypt. And there is miracle after miracle after miracle, and voice of God and everything that happens. It is just so overpowering. By the time you hit Purim, however, we are on our own feet, and God is in the background, or more specifically, God is inside of us. So we have learned, we have matured through that year cycle of holidays, that God rests within us, within our actions, and we must act if we want what God wants, meaning deliverance, an end to suffering. We are then the instruments of that, and we're not looking for the miracles that come from, C.C. DeMille's 10 Commandment. We're instead looking to be the miracle that will bring deliverance, and looking at the unusual circumstances as saying, you know what, this may be what God has had in mind, but we still have to do it. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, the question I get asked the most is, did it really happen? What is the historicity of this story? Right? We don't expect to find any records of the Exodus because it happened in a time and in a way that there wouldn't have been any third-party observation, and the Egyptians were unlikely to write down if they got embarrassed. That's just not the way governments carve their own monuments to themselves. Go to Washington, D.C., look at all the monuments, find the one that talks about when we lost. Yeah, there's only one that comes even close, which is the monument to the internment camps during World War II for Japanese American citizens. But that is kind of tucked away in the corner, and most people miss it completely. But that is one of the few monuments in American in the American public sphere where we say we messed up. But even there, it's still trying to say we messed up, but we're better now. And that is something. So Purim, on the other hand, is something that we might expect to find records. In fact, we do know that the Greeks, the Persians, and other versions of the Jewish text do talk about the emperors of Persia, because they were kind of a big deal, not just for us, but remember that whole Persia trying to invade Greece thing where we get the marathon from and all of that. And when we do the lineup, when we see who lines up with whom, we know that there was, we'll use the Greek because it's the most familiar, there was Cyrus, Cambyses, and Darius, Xerxes, and Artaxerxes. And if you try to line this up, it does seem to work out pretty well. Now you may be thinking, wait, how can this work out with Ahasuerus being Xerxes? That doesn't even sound right. Yeah, Darius is Darius and Cyrus is Cyrus, and we can put Cambyses in there, that's fine, but Ahasuerus doesn't really sound like Xerxes. The problem is, in Greek, they didn't like beginning with the actual Persian pronunciation. And I will apologize in advance to any Persians who are listening. Kheshayarsha is apparently how the Persians would have pronounced the emperor that we're talking about. Now, Kheshayarsha, Ahasuerus, right? It's just a question of putting a introduction. Ahasuerus, Ahasuerusha, they're actually, if we're going to link up languages, not that far off from each other. I have to admit, it's also a lot closer than Xerxes is. But that's because different languages render letters in different ways. Most famous for Hebrew to English, for example, is my own name. All right, my name is Joshua. There is no J in Hebrew. There didn't used to even be a J in English until quite recently. And the actual Hebrew word is Yehoshua. Now, if you showed someone the name Yehoshua and you showed someone the name Joshua, if you showed them the lineage, you could actually get them to realize that those are the same name. And indeed, Ahasuerus, especially when you see it in some of the other forms in the Aramaic or in Hebrew, where we pronounce it Hashiarsha, right, and other pronunciations, you can see that that is indeed Xerxes as the emperor, most likely, who was the main lead of the story. Okay, following that, not important that you memorize all those names, but just to show that, yes, it does fit into the timeline. And it fits into the timeline for other reasons, right? So Persian inscriptions from Kheshayarsha, the Xerxes timeline, it states that he ruled from Hidush to Kushia, right? Now, Hodu is Hidush and Kush is Kushia, and that is indeed the description that is used in the Megillah. So the Persian description of his territory and the Megillah's description of his territory matches 100%. We know that Xerxes reigned from 486 to 465 BCE. That would mean, according to the Megillah text, that the party, the one where Vashti got kicked out, would have been in the third year of his reign. That's what chapter 1 tells us. That the party would have been in 489 BCE. That means that Esther was chosen in the winter of the 7th year. We see that in chapter 2, which would make that 479 BCE.
I think it's 483, not 489.
480. Did I do the math wrong?
Yes.
Yes, I did. Yes, because we're going down, exactly. Right, 486 minus 3, that should have been 483. Thank you. Did I get the rest of it wrong too then? Right, so Esther was then chosen 7 years after his reign. That's 486 minus 7, 479, that's okay. And then Xerxes returned from his failed invasion of Greece in 479. All right, do we notice a convergence here? All right, we know from Greek and Persian history that Xerxes tried to invade Greece in 479, and he got back in 479. That's if you've ever seen the movie 300, right? The Battle of Thermopylae with the Spartans, you know, we are Sparta and all of that other nonsense, right? So Sparta was not a really nice place. They may have defended Greece, and we might be happy for that for Western civilization, but they were not nice people. You know, anybody that lets their babies lay out and die if they're not good enough is not going to get a gold star in my book. But Xerxes lost that war, and Xerxes has to come home. What do you do when you come home? When you are depressed and down? Well, you party, right? You pretend like things are good. You find a new beautiful wife, right? You try to create a situation that will be positive for yourself. And it also explains why between the 3rd and 7th year, as the Megillah talks about it, he didn't get a replacement wife. He was busy invading Greece. And then when he comes back is when he sort of reboots his life. So he returns, we know, and from the Persian sources, he comes back to the palace of Darius in Susa. And we know that this palace was something that was famous for being beautiful and wealthy. So it does match the timeline of Xerxes' life. It doesn't put him in the wrong place at the wrong time. The story markers do match the other markers of his own time. Not bad, not bad. Again, we don't have video, we don't have photos of him at the location, but it does seem to at least be very plausible. Additionally, according to Greek sources, no Persian have survived, Xerxes had a wife called Amestris. Now, there's no record of a wife called Vashti, so it's not perfect, but Amestris does seem quite close. Now, the Greeks, who hated the Persians, you know, that whole invasion thing kind of made them a bit bitter. They describe Amestris as being a cruel queen who slaughters her enemy. They say she was born from a military commander called Otanes, but do not mention her being Jewish. Her father is, meaning Esther's father, is called Avichail. Now, in the Megillah, that would literally translate as my father, a warrior, right? Avichail, right? My father is a warrior. Just as Esther had a different name, Hadassah, he may also have been called something similar to Otanes, or whatever the Hebrew version of that Greek. So Avichail may have been a title that he had, rather than being his personal name. Avichail may have been just another way of saying he was a military guy, right? That her father was, what? Right, her father was a soldier. It may be more descriptive rather than an actual proper name. It's also important to see here that when the Greeks complain about Amestris slaughtering her enemies, in a sense, that is ultimately what Esther does, right? Esther, the little pushover girl, eventually becomes a very strong queen, much stronger than Vashti ever was. And she is the one who convinces the king to allow the Jews to fight back. And that leads to the death of many of the enemies of the Jews who came looking for easy pickings and instead found an armed resistance. So from the outside, for the Greeks, that was humiliating and shameful. They weren't really big on strong women. And the idea that the queen would have that kind of power and authority, they thought was shameful. Again, Greeks, not exactly gold star people. And then if you were writing propaganda against the Persians, you would mock them for allowing their women to have that kind of power. So just because they said that she was nasty doesn't mean she was actually nasty. Make sense? Okay. But how do we get from Amestris to Esther? Well, actually pretty simply, right? So Amestris, you'll notice that we focus on the consonants because that's the way that the languages of the Middle East mostly work. That's why you'll notice when you're learning Hebrew that the Hebrew has the letters and then the vowels are sort of added along to it, right? Consonants are dominant, the vowels are secondary. The vowels are how we conjugate words and how we add the what's that?
Feminine.
Right, exactly, how we declension, right? For feminine or for masculine, for plural or singular, the vowels are secondary, if you will. It's the main root letters, the consonants that matter most. So I've highlighted the consonants and left the vowels as less, so that helps us work. Now, the is ending is a Greek form of the is, like Xerxes, right? So therefore, we can basically ignore that because that's just the way the Greeks throw things onto other foreign words. So really, the name is probably something more like Amester. The core letters of Esther are STR, the sitr, right? Again, we ignore the in the word Esther because that's just the way we spell it in English, but there is no in Hebrew. As you'll know, anytime you speak to an Israeli who still hasn't matched that English sound, many Israelis have very difficult time saying the sound. Because if you don't grow up doing it, it's hard. Just like for most Americans, saying the sound in Hebrew is hard until they've practiced it. So we are looking at the same, except for the M at the beginning. But the STR is identical, apart from the M at the front. Now, the M at the front, the M, that's not an unusual prefix to occur in many words and many different versions. For example, in Hebrew itself, we will often find the mem at the beginning of many of the participle forms, midaber, right? The root word is actually the DBR, the daber, but in certain conjugations, mems will be added, the m will be added to the beginning of the word. So the idea that STR, Esther, Mester, these are as close as we're likely to get. Again, is it a smoking gun? Maybe, right? So an interesting footnote to all of this is that Artaxerxes, the son that comes after Xerxes, who supported Ezra and Nehemiah's effort to finish the rebuilding of the temple and the walls of Jerusalem, and who standardized Jewish rule in Israel, was, through his mother, Jewish, right? Artaxerxes came from Amestris, and if Amestris is Esther, then that means that the Persian emperor was Jewish, at least by Jewish halakha. And even if he didn't practice Judaism, he certainly supported the rebuilding of the temple and the re-strengthening of the Jewish community in Israel, which might go a long way to explaining why he helped, because his mom kept saying, you have to do more for our people back in Judea. Help them out. And, you know, even an emperor is not going to say no to his mom. Okay. So how do we celebrate? Let's get to the mitzvot, the actual commandments of what we do to celebrate. Well, there are a few that work. One that we do is the reading of the Megillah, right? Mikra Megillah is the commandment most people are familiar with. We also send gifts to friends, Mishloach Manot. We also give gifts to the poor, Matanot le'evyonim. And we also have a Purim feast, what is known as Seudat Purim. We'll talk about each of these.
I forgot, we have a fast day before Purim.
That is technically not a mitzvah, in the sense that it is not established in the book of Esther itself as being a fixed piece, and it's something that has the status more of custom than it does of halakha. Unlike Tisha B'Av or other fast days, it's one that doesn't appear as a biblically mandated activity. It's very rabbinical, whereas these are all embedded within the story of Purim itself. So it is part of how we commemorate Purim, but it is not officially a mitzvah of Purim. Okay, so let's take them in order. So reading the Megillah. Everyone has this obligation, right? Everybody is obligated in the reading of Megillah, men, women, converts, slaves, etc. This is taken from Rambam's Mishnah Torah. Children should also be trained to read it. Even Kohanim should neglect the temple service to come hear the reading of the Megillah, right? There is no excuse of, I'm too busy, because even if you are at the altar of Jerusalem, you should come hear the reading of the Megillah. It is that important of a mitzvah. And we read it both in the night as well as in the morning. Hearing is considered the same as reading, which means even if you can't read it yourself, if you listen to the reading, you're okay. And it's best to read from a proper scroll, written much like a Torah scroll is written. But if you can't, you can read it from a printed text. You can even read it in a foreign language if that's all you've got. But the ideal is, of course, to read it from the scroll. Make sense? Yes. Okay. Boom. Again, taking from Rambam. One who speaks a language other than Hebrew and hears the Megillah read in Hebrew, written in the Holy Script, fulfills his obligation, even though he does not understand what is being read. Meaning, yes, if you can't speak Hebrew, but you hear it in Hebrew, you've still done your job, right? That is okay. However, if it was written in Greek, he also fulfills his obligation, even if he does not understand. Greek had special status because of the way the Greek Bible was written. That's a story for another day. Technically, you could even have a Greek Torah. I don't know of anyone who still does. That's been out of fashion for about 2,000 years. However, if the scroll was written in Aramaic or another language, one fulfills the obligation only if the language is understood. So if somebody was to chant the story of Esther in Russian and you don't speak Russian, you still have to go read it or hear it in a language you understand, or Hebrew, or technically Greek. But I think outside of Greece, you're going to have a hard time finding anyone reading the Megillah in Greek. Make sense? So Hebrew is fine even without comprehension, although prefer comprehension or at least reading along with the translation. And otherwise, it has to be with full understanding.
So it can be read in English.
It can be read in English. Again, ideally, we like to do it in Hebrew, but if it helps link people to the story and bring them in, we will often use English to help make that connection. Exactly. And you'll find that many congregations will try to balance this. So for example, here at Temple Israel, we will do an English mixed reading, both Hebrew as well as English parts for our evening reading. But we do the full Hebrew reading at the JCC Academy Minyan on the morning of Purim, but that's at 7:45 in the morning. So you're intrepid, you can get there and have a good time.
I don't get it. Why Aramaic? You have to understand.
Because
that reading.
Because Aramaic is not Lashon HaKodesh, it's not a holy language. Okay. So therefore, the only reason to do it in Aramaic is if that's your language. So if you don't speak Aramaic, you get no benefit from just hearing the Aramaic translation. Okay, oh, come on, flip. There we are. Second mitzvah, gifts. So we mishloach manot, with the giving of gifts. A person is obligated to send 2 portions of meat, 2 other cooked dishes, or 2 other foods to a friend based on sending portions to one another. That's a quote taken from chapter 9 in Esther. This mitzvah is known as mishloach manot. If one does not have the means, one should instead exchange meals with a friend. So what they're describing here is that it says we should send portions to one another. The most natural way to give a gift in the ancient world was to give a gift of food. Right? That was precious because food was scarce. I mean, I know nowadays we try to avoid too much food. Back then, you had the opposite problem. And so sending a gift of food or special food was a very special gift indeed. Also, most people didn't have ready cash that they could just, hand gift cards to everyone with. And it wasn't a consumer society to give people gifts of items. So food was really the best thing to give, and something that we still use as the basis for mishloach manot. We put together little bags in my family, and then we give them to friends and other people, and it's full of different types of food for people to celebrate. However, if you're poor, if you don't have enough money to buy food that you're going to give away to someone else, you agree that I'll give you this and you'll give me something else back, and now we both get to eat, and we also both get to do the mitzvah. So it's a way to make sure that you don't starve yourself to death trying to fulfill this, but also you still do it by giving something equal between 2 people that are friends. Make sense? We are very clever. Okay. We also have the mitzvah of matanot le'evyonim, gifts to the poor. It says again in our halacha in Jewish law, one is obligated to distribute tzedakah, what often gets translated as charity, to the poor on the day of Purim. At the very least, to give each of 2 poor people a present, whether it be money, cooked dishes, or other food, based on, another quote, gifts to the poor, also from chapter 9. This mitzvah is known as matanot le'evyonim. We should not be discriminating. Instead, we should give to whomever stretches out their hand. So what Rambam here is trying to say is, you don't walk around looking for the most deserving poor person, or the nicest poor person, or the poor person who you just, it's always so friendly to you. If someone says, can you help me? You help them, right? That's the first person that asks is the person that you give on Purim. And it is specifically meant to be done on Purim, so that your joy and celebration is also added to their joy and celebration of having been helped. So although, of course, you can help them the day before and you should help the day after, doing it on the day of Purim is very important as well. Good? Okay. And then we come to the part everybody loves, feasting, the seudah. What is the nature of our obligation for the seudah, for the feast? A person should eat meat and prepare as attractive a seudah as his means permit. He should drink wine until he becomes drunk and falls asleep. Again, this is from Rambam. Now, meat was something that people did not have very often. You might have meat only a few times during a year, usually on holidays, and you didn't get meat just on Tuesdays, and so that always made the meal extra special. People were sort of involuntary vegetarians for much of the year, simply because they couldn't afford to eat their animals. And wine as well was something that was important for helping people to have an additional measure of joy in the ancient world. Their wine also was not quite as strong as ours. Getting drunk was considered important, as we'll talk about in just a second, because most of the main action that happened during the story of Purim happened around drinking parties. That seemed to be a big Persian thing, and we're sort of using that as a reminder of the main events of the story of Purim. So drinking figures prominently. More on that in a minute. Very important, however, this feast happens during the daytime, not the night. So Jewish holidays begin in the evening, and they continue until the next evening. That means the feast is supposed to happen as your midday meal on the daytime of Purim. So Purim night, you come to the synagogue, you hear the Megillah being read, and then the next morning, you wake up, you go to the synagogue, you hear the Megillah read, and you do all the other parts of our service, and then you come home, and now is when you cook up and lay out your big feast, and you eat and go to sleep and just enjoy that moment during the day. And no one's driving anywhere while they're drunk, and no one misses any of the other mitzvahs just because they got plowed the night before. Unfortunately, in the modern world, a lot of people get this backwards. They think it's Purim, I'm supposed to be drunk. No, it's Purim, I'm supposed to be paying attention to the Megillah, I'm supposed to be giving gifts to my friends, and I'm supposed to be helping the poor. And then eventually, I'm supposed to have a great meal and drink more than I normally do. A lot of people seem to elevate the drinking as being the most important part of the holiday. It can be a little bit of a problem. Okay, so as Rambam goes on to say, very, very pointedly, it is better to be more liberal with their donations to the poor than to be lavish with their seudah, or sending to friend, right? If you have to choose, you're looking at your budget for the holiday, and you say, well, I've got $100, so I can spend $85 on my feast, and I can spend $15 on, or I can spend $10 on my friends, and $5 on the poor. You've got it wrong, right? You're supposed to flip that entirely, right? We're supposed to help the poor first, more than our own feast. There is no greater and more splendid happiness than to gladden the hearts of the poor, the orphans, the widows, and the converts. One who brings them happiness resembles the Shekhinah, God's presence, to revive the spirit of the lowly and to revive those with broken hearts. A quote taken from Isaiah, meaning that you should be happier by how you help people in need than you should be from what you experience from the bottle or from your plate. And if you're only getting happy from the bottle or the plate, well, Rambam says something else. When a person eats and drinks in celebration, but locks the gates to his courtyard, means to keep out the riffraff, and does not provide for the poor and bitter souls, bitter meaning people who are suffering, his happiness is not the happiness of the mitzvah, of the commandment, but the happiness of his gut. You may think you're being happy, but God's not telling us to be happy in stupid ways. God's telling us to be happy in spiritual ways. And yes, the food goes along with that, and that's fine, but that's not the point, right? It's not about an excuse to stuff our face. If you stuff your face while also holding everyone else away, you're just stuffing your face. Such happiness is a disgrace based on, taken from Malachi, the prophet, I will spread dung on your faces, the dung of your feasts. Yeah, it's kind of, man, people did not speak so diplomatically in the Middle Ages. And Rambam tries to point out that if all you're doing is having a great party because it makes you feel good and you're ignoring everyone else, then your feast is basically a load of dung, dung, and you're just rubbing your face in it. And that's not the way it's supposed to go. But let's talk a little bit more about drinking, because a lot of people really fixate on this. In fact, there are real issues with drinking on college campuses, and real issues in drinking sometimes with drunk driving. Lots of issues sometimes where people think it's funny to make underage kids drink until they throw up. This is an issue. But where does it come from, this idea that we're supposed to drink on Purim at all? Well, in the Talmud, said Rava, a man is obligated to drink on Purim until he no longer knows the difference between cursed is Haman and blessed is Mordechai. Now, story that happens after the description. Rabbah and Rabbi Zera celebrated the Purim meal together. They got drunk. Rabbah arose and slaughtered Rabbi Zera, right? He literally kills the other guy. The next day, he prayed, meaning he wakes up with the mother of all hangovers, and he wakes up and finds his friend and colleague is dead, and he prays and revives him. And it turns out he's not actually dead. He was just mostly dead. Princess Bride reference. And it's all good. The following year, Rabbah said, would the master like to come and we will celebrate the Purim meal together? He invites him the next year to come back. And Rabbi Zeir said to him, a miracle does not occur every hour. It's like, what, do you think I'm stupid? Last year you got drunk and killed me, and only by God's miracle did I not die. And now I'm going to come and risk that again? No, thank you. Right, so right after the discussion of drinking on Purim being important, we get a story in the Talmud, which people usually don't quote, that describes how drinking can lead to horrible, horrible catastrophe. Mm-hmm. So this is meant to be a cautionary tale to balance out the idea of drinking. And indeed, thanks to that, the sages throughout the last couple thousand years worth of commentary have tried to give us ways of understanding drink a lot with this in mind. And so we're going to run through some of those. So one, the Bach, he said one is literally required to become so intoxicated that one can't tell the difference between the two phrases. Blessed is Mordechai, cursed is Haman. It is the only way to explain the killing, because otherwise, how do you get so drunk you kill your friend unless you're so drunk you can't even see the difference between blessed is Mordechai and cursed is Haman. However, most other authorities do not agree with that reading. Beit Yosef and Tosafot, you get drunk until you can't recite the full song, cursed is Haman, blessed is Mordechai, cursed is Zeresh, blessed is Esther, cursed all the wicked, blessed are the Jews, which is a pretty hard song to sing. And so the idea is you get so drunk until you can't really sing the song anymore. So rather than being the literal phrases, it's about keeping up with the music. And Rabbah's statement can't be taken literally. That is to say that we can't believe there was actually a murder. Maybe they got into a fight, maybe one of them got hurt, maybe somebody, was dead drunk, but we shouldn't take it as being an actual murder happening. The Aguda, he says, until you can't do the gematria. Gematria is the Hebrew equivalent of Roman numerals, where every letter has a number that is attached to it. And therefore, if you do the math, Arur Haman, the Hebrew for cursed is Haman, and Baruch Mordechai, the Hebrew for blessed is Mordechai, both equal 502. So get drunk enough that you can't do that math. Now, I'm guessing that most people in this room can't do that math already. So you're already good, right? Just raise your glass and you're already fine. But the idea would be that it's not about the words themselves. It's about saying, well, an aleph is one and and doing the math. And if you can't do that math, you've had enough, right? That's the sobriety test. Rather than walking the line or touching your nose with your fingers, it's do math. If you can't do math anymore, put down the glass. You've had enough. The Kolbo offers instead that there should be no drunkenness at all, right? It may cause sin, like, murder, or at the very least, missing the Megillah reading or not hearing it properly or not taking care of the poor. When you're drunk, you're not able to do things very well. A little drinking can increase the making the poor joyful and comforted. So yeah, a little drinking if you need it, but it's not such a big deal. It's Sfat Emet. It just means to rejoice and drink continually. Yeah, keep drinking, but don't drink so much that you do something dangerous. The Ramah says, some say that drinking enough to put you to sleep is plenty, because while asleep, no one can tell the difference between anything, right? So yes, you drink a little more than usual, you take a little nap, problem solved. We've done it. And the Mishnah Berurah, as the Ramah, but not if it affects doing other mitzvot, meaning you can drink and you can take a nap, but don't take a nap and forget to do all of the other commandments that you're supposed to be doing. So as you can see, the tradition, except for one, are pretty heavily weighted towards the idea that we don't get so drunk that we're actually what would now be classified as intoxicated, right? If you were to put a breathalyzer up to most people in these cases, they probably wouldn't register as being drunk. And again, if you are going to get drunk, make sure you're doing it at the right time, which is the afternoon of Purim, and make sure you're doing it in the right place, which is at your own table in your own house, not out and certainly not behind the wheel of a car. Liturgy. We have a number of things we do in our prayers that get a little different on Purim. One of them is we recite Al Hanisim. You may remember we also do Al Hanisim for Hanukkah. Al Hanisim ve'al hapurkan. People might remember the song part of it. But that is what we add into Modim, one of the blessings of the Amidah, where we basically say, thank you, God, for the miracle of saving us from this horrible catastrophe. We do not recite Hallel. Hallel is the collection of Psalms, 113 through 118, that we normally add for most of our holidays. But in Purim, it is strangely missing. Why? Well, reading the Megillah is like reading Hallel, meaning that we've already done a joyous reading. It's called the Megillah. Two, it did not bring about redemption, right? It just prevented destruction. When we got out of Egypt, that was redemption. When we avoided Haman, that wasn't redemption. That was just not destruction. And we went from negative 100 back to 0. We didn't actually get positive 100. It was just preventing a disaster. And although we're still happy about it, it's not a reason to do Hallel. And C, the victory happened outside of Israel. All the other times when we do Hallel, it's commemorating something that was associated directly with the land of Israel. Whereas the story of Purim happened far, far away and really had no direct bearing on the status of Jews in Israel in and of itself. Customs. Probably the most famous symbol of Purim is the Hamantashen, also called Oznei Haman, which literally means Haman's ears, which is such a wonderful image of just chewing on someone's ear. And these pastries, cookies are filled usually with fruit, my preference, or some other type of filling. What's that?
No.
Oh, okay. Now, Hamantashen probably were invented around the 1700s when pockets of dough filled with poppy seeds, called Montaschen in German, were literally called poppy pockets, if you wanted to translate Montaschen. And they became popular throughout Europe. But we said, hey, wait a minute. Montaschen? Hamantaschen? It's like just, it's a pun based off the German translated into Hebrew. And we're good with languages. And so that's probably what happened is we preserved this tradition because it worked so well with the Hebrew for Haman's name. And that became a festival food that we still eat, even though the rest of Europe has moved on to other pastries. Good? Good. If you want to try some good Hamantashen, you can come to our carnival this coming Sunday, where we're having a Hamantashen competition of the best baked Hamantashens. And before that is to say, long before Hamantashens in the 1700s, there were different treats in different countries. Every local region had their own variety of food that they would eat on the holiday. As I mentioned, we're having a carnival. This is normal in most congregations. Private feasts are the mitzvah, but the communities often want to add to the party atmosphere, and they hold carnivals with funs and games for children and adults. Sometimes this will happen on Purim itself. Sometimes this will happen near Purim if it's a more convenient day, which is why our Purim carnival is on the 10th, even though Purim is actually on the 20th and 21st. But that's in the middle of spring break. And unfortunately, if we put the carnival in spring break, we're not going to get the attendance, and it's a shame. We still have to do the Megillah reading on the actual day, and that will still be a lot of fun. But the carnival and all the other games and things, that's going to happen this coming Sunday. And at that, you will find a lot of people wearing costumes. Again, one of the most iconic parts of celebrating Purim nowadays is people dressing up in costumes, kids and adults. Why? Well, the miracle of Purim came about through hidden identities. Esther didn't tell who she was. No one knew that Mordecai was related to her. Haman seemed like a nice guy, but he was actually a terror. Everybody was all dressed in different costumes. And how did it finally come out at the end? By Esther tearing off her costume and saying, "Here's who I am." Right? That was the major moment of the story. So we wear costumes in remembrance of that connection to how the story unfolded. And that's Purim in a very, very condensed nutshell. Obviously, there's a lot more to learn, a lot more to do, and hopefully you'll be able to experience, if not the carnival, even more importantly, the Friday night, the Wednesday night or Thursday morning Megillah readings and that celebration as well. I believe we start at 6 p.m. on Wednesday night, the 21st. And then, like I said, the JCC Academy Minyan is Thursday morning at 7:45. 7:45. Yep, it's a weekday. It's if it was a weekend, we do it later. But when it's a weekday, we got to be early so that people who are going to work can make it to work, or at least not be too late. Any questions on
Only
Purim?
one week?
Only
Thursday. For some synagogues, they do it one in the morning and then one just before the Seudah.
No, as far as the
Just
community
one.
goes, we're only having the one. Yeah. And of course, you are welcome to read. If you can't make it to either of those, you are welcome to read the Megillah on your own. And that is not just welcome to, but a mitzvah. You should definitely read the story of Purim on the day. It's only 10 chapters. If you're reading it on your own, it'll take you maybe half an hour. It's not a huge time commitment. I'd be willing to bet you could probably even find YouTube versions of it, which might be interesting. But I can't endorse any particular ones because I haven't checked them. So be careful when you look, but there's probably some floating out there. Okay, great.